I want to start by asking you a seemingly simple question.
Okay.
Can a U.S. president who has already served 2 terms ever serve a third?
I mean, if you ask almost anyone, the instinctive answer is a hard no, right?
Exactly, yeah. It's one of those fundamental rules of American politics that we just accept as a given. 2 terms and you're done.
Yeah, it feels as permanent as the law of gravity. Like we think of the presidency as having this strict expiration date. You hit your limit and the door to the Oval Office is locked forever.
But today, we're doing a deep dive into the actual fine print of the Constitution. Yeah. And we have a really fascinating piece of source material to guide us.
We do. It's Alan Dershowitz's 2026 book, Could President Trump Constitutionally Serve a Third Term? My Nonpartisan Legal Analysis.
Right. And right out of the gate, we need to make something incredibly clear to you, the listener. This deep dive is strictly a thought experiment about constitutional mechanics.
Yes, strictly mechanics.
We are not taking sides, left or right. We're not endorsing any candidate. We are simply examining the objective rules of the game as they're written down.
And that neutrality is so vital here because the legal analysis we're about to unpack, it applies identically whether we're talking about Donald Trump, Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, or any other twice elected president in the future.
Exactly. We are stripping away the partisan bias and just putting the machinery of the law under a microscope.
Right.
So consider this your shortcut to being the most well-informed person in the room, because you are about to get a major aha moment about a massive hidden loophole in the Constitution.
It's wild. It really proves that the rules governing us are far messier than we like to think.
Yeah, much more human. So before we can understand why this loophole exists, we have to look exactly at what the text actually says.
To do that, we have to turn to the 22nd Amendment, which was ratified in 1951. That's the part of the Constitution dealing with term limits.
And the specific phrasing is the entire battleground here. The text reads, "No person shall be elected to the office of the president more than twice."
Elected.
Yeah.
Elected.
That single word is the hinge of the entire argument.
It strictly forbids being elected more than twice, but it glaringly omits broader words that the Constitution uses all the time in other places.
Right. Words like serve or hold or act as president.
Exactly.
And in constitutional law, statutory construction relies heavily on the presumption that if a specific word is used, it was chosen deliberately.
Right.
So if a broader word is omitted, that omission is also assumed to be intentional. The 22nd Amendment does not explicitly state a twice-elected president can never serve again.
It merely dictates they cannot be elected to the office again.
Exactly. And that semantic gap opens up 3 hypothetical yet legally plausible workarounds for how a former president could return to power without ever being at the top of the ticket.
Okay, let's unpack this. The first scenario the source material outlines is the VP swap.
Right, the VP swap. So a twice-elected president runs as the vice presidential candidate. Their running mate wins the presidency, and then, for whatever reason...
Resignation, health issues, whatever.
Yeah, the new president steps down. The VP is elevated, and suddenly the former president is back in the Oval Office without having been elected as president.
And this isn't just some academic fantasy either.
No. We saw this idea floated for J.D. Vance and Donald Trump, and decades earlier, serious legal scholars suggested it for Al Gore and Bill Clinton back in 2000.
Right, because the mechanics of the Constitution seem to permit it. And it doesn't stop at the vice presidency either.
Oh, right. The second scenario?
Yeah, the second scenario bypasses the executive branch entirely at first. It's the Speaker ascension.
Oh, this one is crazy.
It is. So the former president is appointed Speaker of the House. Then, if both the sitting president and vice president seats become vacant, maybe a tragedy or a double resignation, the Speaker is next in the line of succession.
And they ascend to the presidency again without being elected to the executive branch. And here is the wild card we often forget about the Speaker's chair. The Constitution doesn't actually mandate that they be an elected member of Congress.
Right.
The text just says the House shall, quote, choose their Speaker.
Spelled with a C-H-U-S-E. Back in the day.
Yeah, exactly. So you could technically appoint a former president who wasn't even in the legislature. It's like a bouncer at an exclusive club being handed a photo of a guy and told, do not let this guy in through the front door.
I love this analogy.
Right. So the bouncer is strictly enforcing the election rule at the main entrance. But there is absolutely no rule written down anywhere saying the guy can't just walk through the kitchen and take a seat at the VIP table.
The back doors are completely unguarded.
Yeah, the lines of succession are the kitchen door.
Which brings us to the third scenario. A situation where the election itself breaks down.
The House tiebreaker.
Right. If no presidential candidate secures a majority in the Electoral College, the decision goes to the House of Representatives. Under the 12th Amendment, the House shall choose the president.
And legal arguments suggest that being chosen by the House is a distinct constitutional mechanism from being elected by the voters.
Exactly. It potentially bypasses the 22nd Amendment's specific ban on being elected.
But wait, doesn't the 12th Amendment create a roadblock for that first scenario, the VP swap?
How so?
Well, the 12th Amendment states that no person constitutionally ineligible to the office of president shall be eligible to that of vice president.
Right.
So if you've hit your term limit, aren't you ineligible?
What's fascinating here is the precise interception of those two amendments.
Okay.
The 12th Amendment says you cannot be vice president if you are constitutionally ineligible to be president. But the 22nd Amendment only makes a former president ineligible to be elected.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it does not render them ineligible to serve. And this isn't just a fringe theory. Top constitutional scholars, including Harvard's Lawrence Tribe.
And he's famously a vocal critic of Donald Trump.
Very vocal. But even he concedes this point. Tribe acknowledged that a former president technically isn't barred from serving a third term via succession so long as they aren't elected to it.
That's amazing. Textualism forces even the harshest critics to respect the letter of the law over their personal preferences.
It really does.
But if this loophole is so glaringly obvious to anyone parsing the text today, it begs the question of how the founders missed it.
Right, these were some of the most meticulous legal minds in history.
Exactly. Drafting the blueprint of our government. How did they mess this up?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the twist is that the founders didn't overlook term limits at all.
They didn't.
No, they actively hated the idea of them.
Wait, really?
Yeah. At the Constitutional Convention in 1787, this was the subject of a massive, heated debate. George Mason from Virginia warned against endless terms. He argued that without limits, the presidency would devolve into an elective monarchy.
Which makes sense. I want to push back a bit on the idea that Mason's side was somehow the minority view, though. They had literally just fought a bloody revolution to rid themselves of a monarch. The fear of a king wasn't abstract, It was the entire foundation of their political reality.
That's very true.
So how did Alexander Hamilton and Gouverneur Morris possibly win that debate?
Hamilton made a deeply pragmatic argument about human nature and governance. He argued that re-eligibility preserves a leader's drive for public esteem and the love of fame.
The love of fame, yeah.
Right. Hamilton believed that if a president knew they had a mandatory expiration date, they might become corrupt.
Because if they know they're being forced out regardless of their performance, the incentive to govern well disappears.
Exactly. The temptation to loot the treasury or consolidate private power on the way out just skyrockets. And furthermore, Hamilton argued against artificially depriving the nation of experienced leaders during a crisis.
Like a war.
Yeah, if a war breaks out in year 8 of a good president's term, Hamilton thought the public should have the right to keep them at the helm.
Okay, but even if Hamilton won the theoretical debate at the convention, our grade school history teaches us that George Washington stepping down after 2 terms established this grand unwritten rule.
Right, the 2-term tradition.
Yeah. Was Washington really just operating on personal preference, or did he feel the political temperature and realize an American king wouldn't fly?
Washington's motivations were overwhelmingly personal, actually, though they had massive political consequences.
Really?
Yeah. He voluntarily stepped away, not because he believed a 3rd term was unconstitutional or fundamentally dangerous, but because he was exhausted.
He just wanted to go home.
Literally. He wrote that he sought the shade of retirement.
Wow.
It was Thomas Jefferson who came along later and weaponized Washington's personal fatigue into a rigid political principle. He framed it as a necessary rotation in office.
So a foundational pillar of American executive transition rested entirely on an unwritten gentleman's agreement, just because Washington wanted to relax.
Pretty much. And that gentleman's agreement held the country together for 150 years.
Though there were challengers.
Oh, yeah. Ulysses S. Grant sought a 3rd term and was rejected by his own party. Teddy Roosevelt tried for a 3rd term with his Bull Moose party and failed.
Right.
But the norm held firm until Franklin Delano Roosevelt. FDR shattered it, serving 4 terms.
But we have to consider the context there. He was navigating the unprecedented twin crises of the Great Depression and World War II.
Exactly. It took a perfect storm of a highly popular incumbent and massive global instability to finally shatter a century and a half of tradition.
Which proves that political norms are powerful, but incredibly fragile when faced with the true crisis.
Yes.
So FDR breaks the norm, and suddenly Congress panics. They realize that relying on the honor system doesn't work forever.
No, it doesn't.
They scramble to put this into writing. And that brings us to 1947, the drafting of the 22nd Amendment, and the exact moment this giant loophole was accidentally born.
Right. Congress decided they needed a hard, codified rule. And the early drafts of the 22nd Amendment in 1947 were incredibly strict.
How strict?
Well, the House Judiciary Committee draft explicitly stated a two-term president was ineligible to hold the office.
Ineligible to hold the office?
Yes. If that specific language had been ratified, our entire deep dive today wouldn't exist. The back door would have been permanently deadbolted.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Congress possessed an airtight, foolproof draft. Ineligible to hold the office. It covers succession, it covers being chosen by the House, it covers everything.
Everything.
And they deliberately threw it in the trash. Why trade legal precision for the loophole we have now?
It came down to the messy reality of trying to pass legislation that the general public had to consume and vote on.
Okay.
Senator Warren Magnuson felt the language was becoming too convoluted. He advocated for simpler phrasing so the average voter could easily understand the amendment's purpose.
He wanted the focus strictly on limiting election.
Right. And Senator Robert Taft then formalized this into a compromise. They kept their eyes purely on the immediate prize, which was stopping someone from running for election over and over like FDR did.
So in their rush to compromise and simplify the text for the public, they explicitly rejected the broader catch-all words like serve or hold.
They did.
They sacrificed a watertight constitutional safeguard just to make the final version read a bit more smoothly on a ballot.
It's pretty pathetic.
A massive legislative blunder. But doesn't the intent of the lawmakers matter? We know why they wrote it. They wanted to prevent another FDR. Doesn't the obvious historical intent override a poor choice of vocabulary?
Well, you've just walked right into one of the greatest philosophical battles in American jurisprudence. Textualism versus purposivism.
Okay, break that down for us.
So textualists, a philosophy famously championed by the late Justice Antonin Scalia. They argue that courts must follow the exact letter of the law.
Right.
They argue we are governed by the written text that was passed, not by the unwritten subjective intentions of dead legislators. If the text says elected, it only means elected.
And the purposivists.
Purposivists, like Justice Stephen Breyer, counter that laws are written to solve specific problems. You must interpret the law based on its obvious purpose, especially if a literal reading resurrects the very problem the law was trying to solve.
Which in this case is endless presidential terms.
Exactly.
So when a court analyzes a statute where language was deliberately changed during the drafting process, like we saw in 1947, how do they weigh that history?
Courts generally apply a principle of statutory construction that presumes if Congress deletes limiting language from an earlier draft, that omission was a conscious choice.
So judges can't magically pretend the rejected words are still on the page.
Right. Because Congress explicitly debated the phrase ineligible to hold the office and affirmatively replaced it with shall not be elected, a strict textualist judge would conclude that the text explicitly permits a third term via succession.
The law is the law.
The law is the law.
Okay, let's unpack this and take it out of the drafting room and into the real world. If a former president actually utilizes this textual loophole to slide into the vice presidency or the speaker's chair, what are the practical dangers to the American system? Why is this such a volatile hypothetical?
The dangers are structural. They stem directly from the rigid nature of the U.S. presidency. The United States operates a presidential system which functions very differently from parliamentary democracies.
Right, like in Europe or Israel.
Yeah. In Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu has served more than 16 years. In Germany, Angela Merkel served 16 years. But in parliamentary systems, a leader can be removed almost overnight by a vote of no confidence if they lose the support of the legislature.
They are accountable to the parliament.
Exactly. In the U.S., a president enjoys a fixed term and can only be removed via impeachment or the 25th Amendment.
And both of those mechanisms are designed to be notoriously difficult, slow, and, well, politically agonizing.
Very much so.
Our system is engineered to keep the executive in power to ensure stability. There is no easy eject button.
which is precisely why the vice presidency becomes such a vulnerability here. Judge Richard Posner aptly described the vice president as a contingent president.
A contingent president.
Yeah, they are one heartbeat away from wielding total, almost unremovable executive authority. Yet, throughout American history, vice presidents are rarely selected for their actual ability to govern or lead the nation.
Right, they're chosen for electoral calculus.
Exactly. They balance a ticket geographically or ideologically to win a campaign. They're not usually picked to run the country.
You know, I always think of the vice president as a political godparent.
A godparent?
Yeah. When you pick a godparent for your child, you usually do it to honor a friendship or maintain peace in the family or for ceremonial reasons.
True.
You rarely sit down and perform a rigorous audit of their financial stability and parenting skills.
Well, you don't.
But suddenly, if a catastrophic tragedy strikes, that person is legally responsible for running the whole family.
That analogy perfectly captures the terrifying reality of succession. And history is full of these gambles. FDR picked VPs who weren't viewed as serious, viable successors until he finally chose Harry Truman for his fourth term, literally weeks before his death.
Wow.
And we saw intense public panic about the contingent president issue when John McCain, who was 72 with a complex medical history, selected Sarah Palin.
Oh, definitely.
Or in 1991 when George H.W. Bush experienced heart issues and the nation suddenly confronted the reality that Dan Quayle might assume the presidency.
Yeah, so if you place a former dominant two-term president in the VP slot, working under a relatively inexperienced or weaker president, you create an incredibly unstable power dynamic.
Very unstable.
The political gravity would instantly shift to the vice president.
And this raises an important question about the survival of our institutions. If we allow term limits to be bypassed via the VP slot or the speaker's chair, we risk severe democratic erosion.
Because the U.S. system simply isn't built to accommodate indefinite executive power without those easy parliamentary removal mechanisms.
Right. The two-term limit, flawed as its text may be, is our primary structural defense against a president entrenching themselves forever.
Okay, so the text technically allows it, but the historical intent clearly despises it.
Yes.
And the practical outcome could destabilize the executive branch. If a twice-elected president actually attempts this, they get on the ballot as VP, or the House appoints them, someone has to step in.
Someone has to, yeah.
It would inevitably land at the Supreme Court. How does the highest court in the land handle a political grenade of this magnitude?
Honestly, the Supreme Court would find itself in an agonizing no-win situation. They might try to avoid touching it altogether.
Avoid it. How?
Well, Chief Justice John Roberts is a well-known institutional minimalist. He prefers the court to act as umpires calling balls and strikes. He steers clear of massive, system-altering rulings whenever possible.
But this would be the biggest ruling of the century.
Exactly. And the court is hyper-aware of its fragile public standing. Trust in the Supreme Court has plummeted roughly 50% since they effectively decided the 2000 election in Bush v. Gore.
Great.
Taking a case that single-handedly decides the fate of the presidency again could shatter whatever institutional legitimacy they have left.
But how do you dodge the biggest constitutional question of the century? I mean, a former president trying to take over the government again isn't a parking ticket you can just dismiss.
They would rely on procedural doctrines.
Like what?
They might invoke the concept of standing. To sue in federal court, a plaintiff must prove they have suffered a direct, concrete, and personal injury.
So a random voter claiming the Constitution is being violated doesn't usually meet that bar.
Exactly. If nobody has standing to sue, the court throws the case out without ever answering the core question.
Wow.
Alternatively, they might cite the political question doctrine.
What's that?
This is a rule where the court declares that the Constitution delegates a specific issue entirely to another branch of government. They could rule, look, the Constitution gives Congress the power to sort out presidential qualifications and the Electoral College. It's a political dispute, not a judicial one, so we have no jurisdiction.
So what does this all mean? We're essentially saying that the ultimate safeguard of our democracy, the one structural barrier stopping an endless presidency, relies on an honor system.
Kind of, yeah.
Because the Supreme Court might be too terrified of the political backlash to actually enforce the intent of the law.
It is a sobering reality. A decision not to decide is still a profoundly consequential decision. Dodging the case would leave the country in the state of total constitutional limbo, likely sparking a severe national crisis.
Definitely.
If they did muster the courage to take the case, The philosophical ideal would be to judge it using John Rawls's concept of the veil of ignorance.
The veil of ignorance. In this context, that means the justices would have to evaluate the 22nd Amendment completely blind to who the plaintiff is.
Exactly. They would have to render a ruling without knowing if the person trying to exploit the loophole is Donald Trump, Barack Obama, or Bill Clinton. They must decide if the rule applies in principle, devoid of partisan consequences.
But as the source material highlights, true objectivity is almost impossible in modern politics.
It really is. Law professor Michael Dorff provides a glaring example of this hypocrisy.
Oh, right.
In 2000, Dorff argued very publicly that the 22nd Amendment did not block Bill Clinton from running as vice president.
Right.
Yet, when the exact same constitutional loophole became relevant to Donald Trump in 2024, Dorff conveniently reversed his legal philosophy and argued it shouldn't be allowed.
It's amazing. When the political jersey changes, the supposedly ironclad legal principles suddenly transform.
Yep.
It proves just how easily partisan terror overrides objective textual analysis.
And that is exactly why a definitive, universally accepted Supreme Court ruling based purely on text and objective law would be nearly impossible to achieve in our deeply polarized climate. Half the country would view any ruling as a partisan coup.
Let's bring this all together. We tend to revere the U.S. Constitution as this sacred, infallible document handed down from on high, anticipating every possible political crisis.
We do.
But today's deep dive proves it is very much a document written by fallible human beings. It is stitched together with late-night compromises, semantic gaps, and historical accidents.
Definitely.
We have a massive loophole in the highest law of the land, one that could theoretically allow a former president to reclaim total unchecked executive power simply because politicians back in 1947 rushed a compromise to make the text a little bit simpler for voters to read.
Yeah, in their noble pursuit of simplicity, they completely sacrificed legal precision. And they left future generations with a critical constitutional vulnerability that has never been stress tested.
Which leaves me with this final thought for you to chew on. If the highest law of the land harbors a loophole this massive, resting purely on a casually chosen word during a forgotten committee meeting, what other fundamental rights or rules in our legal framework are hanging by a thread of poor vocabulary?
It's a scary thought.
What other unwritten norms are we falsely assuming are locked doors, just waiting for a sufficiently motivated leader to simply push them open in a future crisis? Just remember, no matter how settled the rules of the game seem to be, you always have to read the fine print. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.